Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share tales that touch the heart and challenge the mind. Today, we bring you a story of unexpected twists, powerful lessons, and the true meaning of leadership. In a world that often values numbers over people, can empathy redefine success? Let's dive into Claire's journey, a journey that shows how strength, compassion, and understanding can change everything. Claire Johnson sat quietly in the sleek, minimalist office of Beacon Industries. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the bustling city below, the glass reflecting the cold light of an early afternoon. Yet, despite the pristine elegance of her surroundings, Claire felt as though the air had thickened, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. The humming of the air conditioning, the tapping of her heel against the polished wood floor. These small sounds felt deafening in the moment. She tried to steady her breath, her heart beating faster than usual, as her boss, Ryan Pierce, flipped through a stack of papers on his desk. His office was just as immaculate as the rest of the building, modern. Clean lines, the faint scent of expensive cologne, and a feeling of high-end detachment. Ryan was a man who wore his power like an invisible cloak, one that left little room for warmth or empathy. Everything about him, from his tailored suit to his perfectly combed hair, spoke of someone who had achieved success through ambition, cold calculation, and unyielding control. But none of it mattered now. "Claire," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was as sterile as the space around them. He didn't even look up as he spoke, his gaze still fixed on the papers. "I've reviewed your performance over the last few months, and frankly, it's been underwhelming." The words hit Claire like a slap in the face. Her hands instinctively gripped the armrests of her chair, trying to keep her composure. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but she hadn't expected this coldness, this finality. She had worked so hard, poured everything she had into this company. For 5 years, Claire had given up weekends, evenings, and countless nights away from her son, Liam, to meet deadlines, fix problems, and push through the relentless pressure that came with the job. The sacrifices had been enormous, but she had never once questioned her decision. After all, this was supposed to be for him, for their future. And now this. "I understand you're disappointed," Claire replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She had prepared herself for a difficult conversation, but nothing had prepared her for the words that Ryan was about to say. "If there's something specific I can do better, I'm more than willing to make it right. Just give me another chance." Ryan's eyes finally lifted from the papers, and he regarded her with a cold indifference that made her stomach twist. His gaze was sharp, calculating, and devoid of warmth. "Claire," he said, his voice now dripping with condescension, "this isn't about one project or one mistake. It's about the bigger picture. Your performance has been inconsistent. The clients have started to notice. And frankly, this job requires someone who can maintain a level of excellence across the board, without excuses." Excuses? Claire bit her lip to stop the retort from escaping her mouth. The truth was, she had never made excuses. There had been long nights, countless hours of work, and endless juggling to keep up with the demands of both her career and motherhood. But she couldn't say that. Not to him. Ryan didn't care about the sacrifices. He didn't care about her story, her struggles, or the weight she carried daily. To him, Claire was just another cog in the wheel of the corporate machine, easily replaceable. "Consider this your final day," Ryan continued, his words cutting through her like a blade. "There's no need for further discussion. I'm letting you go effective immediately." Claire's head spun, her world shifting beneath her. She hadn't seen this coming. Not in the least. She worked hard. She'd given so much to this company, sacrificed her time with Liam, and pushed herself beyond her limits to meet expectations. But none of that mattered. The empty look in Ryan's eyes told her everything. To him, she was just a statistic, a number that didn't add up, a problem to be discarded. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, Claire couldn't speak. She wanted to argue, to plead, to explain everything that had gone wrong in the past few months. But as the words formed in her mind, she realized they would fall on deaf ears. There was no room for explanation here. No room for her humanity. She wasn't Claire the person. She was just Claire the employee. Someone who had failed to meet the invisible standards set by a man who couldn't see beyond his own ambition. I don't understand, she stammered. But even as she spoke, the words felt hollow, weak. She was fighting against the tide of inevitability, struggling to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. Please, Ryan, I can fix this. I can do better. Ryan didn't respond. His eyes, now glazed over, stared past her as if she were no longer there. It's over. Claire, he said, his voice colder than before. I've made my decision. Pack your things. For a long moment, Claire sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words crashing down on her. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly before, now felt numb. She barely heard the finality of his words, barely registered the cold dismissal that followed. All she could think about was Liam, her son, the boy who had been counting on her, the boy who had given her purpose. And now, without warning, her life had been torn apart. What would she tell him? How would she explain this? As Claire stood up, she felt a rush of emotions flood her. The disbelief, the anger, the fear, but most of all, she felt a deep, aching sadness. This wasn't just about losing her job. It was about the hope she had carried with her for so long. The hope that her hard work would one day lead to something better, something more. And now, in an instant, that hope had crumbled. With shaky hands, Claire gathered her things, moving slowly, as though trying to convince herself that this wasn't really happening. But deep down, she knew it was. And as she left the office, the weight of Ryan's indifference following her like a shadow, she couldn't help but wonder what would come next, if anything at all. Little did she know, the next chapter of her life was about to take a turn she could never have predicted. Just as Claire opened her mouth to respond, to plead for a chance to redeem herself, the door to the office swung open with a force that startled both of them. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had expected no visitors, and certainly no interruptions. But there he stood, Matthew Carter, the CEO of Beacon Industries, the man who was the very embodiment of the company's success. Tall, sharp-featured, and with an air of authority that could command an entire room with a mere glance. Matthew had a presence that was hard to ignore. Claire hadn't met him personally, but she had seen him around the building, always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, exuding confidence and control. His reputation preceded him, a businessman who had built the company from the ground up, who had an uncanny ability to read people and situations, who could make or break careers with a single decision. His sudden appearance in the room, in the middle of Claire's tense meeting with Ryan, felt like a sign, an omen that she couldn't quite decipher. Ryan looked up, clearly surprised by the intrusion. Matthew, I wasn't expecting you, Ryan said, his tone suddenly less assured than it had been moments before. He quickly stood up, adjusting his tie, clearly eager to impress. Matthew's icy blue eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on Claire. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, he said coolly, though his gaze lingered for a moment longer than it would have on anyone else. There was something about the way he looked at her that made Claire's pulse race, though she couldn't put her finger on why. No, Ryan quickly said, his voice a bit too eager. We were just discussing Claire's, performance. Matthew nodded once, his sharp gaze never leaving Claire. Performance, you say? He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but not entirely convinced by Ryan's casual dismissal. Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew how this conversation was going to unfold. Ryan was about to give the final blow. There was no coming back from this. She had no idea why Matthew Carter was in the office today, but she wasn't going to waste the chance to speak up. I don't think my performance is the problem, Mr. Pierce, Claire said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. She gathered all the courage she could muster to meet Matthew's gaze. I've worked here for 5 years. I've sacrificed a lot for this company. Before she could finish, Matthew raised a hand to stop her. The simple gesture silenced her immediately. Claire felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because she didn't have to continue pleading, but anxiety because she had no idea what was going to happen next. Matthew's gaze turned toward Ryan, his expression unreadable. "Ryan," he began, his voice calm, but with an underlying force that made the air around them shift. "I was under the impression that Beacon Industries valued its employees. I was also under the impression that we worked to build people up, not tear them down. Is that not the company culture you've been cultivating?" Ryan blinked, clearly caught off guard by Matthew's tone. "Of course. Matthew cut him off with a sharp look. No, I don't want to hear your excuses." He turned back to Claire. "Tell me something. Is it true you have a son?" Claire blinked in surprise. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice soft. "His name is Liam. He's waiting for me in the lobby." Matthew's gaze softened ever so slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Ryan," he said, never taking his eyes off Claire, "you fired a woman who's a mother. You didn't even consider that. Did you think she would just forget about her son? You've broken her trust, and now you want her to walk out of here with nothing? For what? A performance review that wasn't even properly discussed." Claire felt the weight of Matthew's words sink in. The air around her seemed to shift again, as though the entire office had become a different place. For the first time in what felt like hours, she could feel her shoulders relax. It wasn't because she thought she was safe. She wasn't sure yet, but there was something undeniably reassuring about Matthew's presence. He wasn't dismissing her. He wasn't pretending to care. He genuinely did. Ryan's face turned red, clearly unable to respond to Matthew's accusations. He stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, before he spoke again, this time with much less confidence. I didn't know about her son. It wasn't something I was aware of." Matthew's gaze never wavered. "Well, now you know. Maybe it's time we all took a step back and re-examine our priorities. Don't you think, Ryan?" The room was silent for a long moment as Matthew's words hung in the air, settling over the three of them like a heavy fog. Finally, Matthew turned back to Claire, his expression shifting into something warmer, less distant, more compassionate. "I'm going to make sure this gets sorted out. You're not walking out of here without a resolution. Ryan, we'll talk later." Ryan's face twitched with barely contained frustration, but he said nothing as Matthew turned his back on him and walked toward the door. Before he left, he turned to Claire with one final look, a look that carried an unspoken promise. "Don't worry, Claire, I'll make this right." And with that, he was gone, leaving Claire standing there in the office, feeling a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Her world had just shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken words. Matthew's presence seemed to hang over Claire like a weight, though it wasn't the same oppressive heaviness that Jacob had cast on her moments before. It was different, less cruel, more curious. His gaze remained steady, as if he was studying her, trying to read her beyond the surface. "Tell me, Claire," Matthew said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. "What exactly is your side of the story here?" Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly flustered by Matthew's unexpected intervention. He glanced briefly at Claire before he cleared his throat. "There's nothing much to discuss," he muttered. "Her performance has been subpar. We've given her plenty of chances, but she hasn't delivered the results we need." Claire could see the dismissive way Jacob waved his hand, as if brushing her off like an insignificant detail in his neatly orchestrated world. The sting of his words pierced through her again. For years, she had put everything into her job, working late nights, sacrificing weekends, taking on extra tasks that no one else wanted. To hear it all dismissed as subpar felt like a gut punch. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Matthew's eyes never left her. "Subpar, is it?" he asked, his voice unusually soft for someone of his stature. Claire took a deep breath, finding the strength to speak despite the lump in her throat. "I've done my best. I've worked hard, but there are things beyond my control. My son, for one," she faltered, the words suddenly feeling so inadequate. How could she explain the weight she had been carrying? the constant struggle to balance work and her responsibilities as a mother. It was as if the universe had conspired to put obstacles in her way. And no matter how hard she tried, the barriers only grew taller. Matthew leaned forward, his intense gaze piercing her. "Your son?" he asked, his voice now filled with genuine interest. "Is everything all right?" Claire blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in his demeanor. It was as if he was no longer seeing her as just an employee, but as a person, a woman who had a life outside of work, a mother. "He's been sick," Claire explained quietly, her voice trembling. "And I've been trying to manage everything. Work, home, the pressure. It's been overwhelming." Matthew nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "I see. And yet you're still here, still pushing through. That says something about your character." "Claire." She blinked, taken aback by his words. No one, certainly not Jacob, had ever looked at her that way. Most people saw her as a cog in the machine, a worker bee, disposable once she outlived her usefulness. But Matthew saw something more. Claire swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to let anyone down. But sometimes it's just too much." For a moment, there was silence. Jacob fidgeted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. But Matthew wasn't done. "Claire," Matthew said, his voice steady, but with a hint of admiration, "you are one of the most dedicated people I've met in this company." And Jacob, he turned his attention to the regional director. "You failed to see that." Jacob looked stunned, unable to hide his surprise. He opened his mouth to protest, but Matthew held up a hand to silence him. "I've been watching the numbers." "Jacob," Matthew continued, "I know the challenges Claire's been facing, and despite it all, she's managed to keep up. Your dismissal of her is short-sighted." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Was this real? Was she really hearing this? For so long, she had believed that her worth was tied to her output, that if she couldn't meet the expectations set by others, she would be left behind. But Matthew wasn't treating her like a failure. He was treating her like a person. Matthew stood up, walking over to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city below. "I believe that when you see someone's true value, you don't discard them. You nurture that potential. I'll tell you what, Claire," he said, turning back to face her. "I want to offer you an opportunity, one that I think could not only benefit you, but also this company." Claire's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. What kind of opportunity? Matthew's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "How would you feel about taking on a more senior role within the company? One that allows you to work remotely, at least for the time being. I know you have a lot on your plate with your son, and I want to give you the flexibility to balance both. You don't have to choose between being a mother and a career woman. You can do both." Claire could hardly believe what she was hearing. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Was this a dream? Matthew wasn't done. "Jacob," he turned toward the stunned regional director, "I suggest you reassess your priorities as well. You've just witnessed what happens when you fail to see the people behind the positions. Now, I want you to go back to your office and think long and hard about what true leadership means." Claire's eyes shifted to Jacob, whose face was now a shade of red she'd never seen before. But she didn't care. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire felt like she had a chance, an opportunity to reclaim her life, her career, and her dignity. "Claire," Matthew said, his voice gentle yet firm, "take some time to think about this, but know that the offer is real. This is your chance to show the world, and yourself, what you're truly capable of." With that, Matthew turned on his heel and left the office, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts, and with the realization that her life had just taken an unexpected, but incredibly welcome turn. As Claire stood there, her mind swirling with emotions, the conversation took a sharp turn, opening up doors to lessons that none of them could have anticipated. For Claire, the lesson was clear. True worth isn't determined by the opinions of others. For so long, she had defined herself through her job, her performance, the approval of others. But as she stood there in front of Matthew, she realized that the balance she sought between work and her family was not a weakness. it was a strength. The love she poured into her son, the sacrifices she made, the choices she had to live with, they all shaped who she was in a way no corporate figure could measure. In the end, her value was not in a spreadsheet or quarterly report, but in the love and resilience she showed every single day. For Jacob, the lesson came in a much more difficult form. True leadership is about understanding the human element, not just the numbers. His approach had always been cold, transactional. He had dismissed Claire so easily, with no thought to her personal struggles or the context of her work. But in the face of Matthew's compassion and Claire's quiet strength, Jacob came to understand that leadership was not just about driving results. It was about recognizing the people behind those results, supporting them through their struggles, and creating an environment that encouraged growth, not fear. True leadership is built on empathy, not authority. And then there was Matthew. He had seen the world through a different lens, a high-powered CEO who had grown accustomed to making decisions based on the bottom line. But in that moment, as he listened to Claire, he saw not just an employee, but a woman who had been pushed to her limit, trying to balance everything life had thrown at her. He realized that compassion was the real currency of leadership. That success was not just measured in profit margins, but in the ability to lift others up, to make difficult decisions that took into account the people behind the numbers. Matthew understood now that the right intervention at the right time could change someone's life, not because of money or power, but because of the respect and dignity one showed to others. As the meeting came to an end, Jacob left the room in silence, the weight of the encounter heavy on his shoulders. Claire walked out of the office with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling as if a burden had been lifted from her chest. And Matthew, standing in the doorway, reflected on how this one conversation had shifted his understanding of what it meant to lead and what it meant to truly see the people who made his success possible. In the end, they all learned that success wasn't just about the climb, it was about how you treated the people along the way. Empathy, understanding, and respect were the keys to real achievement, both in the workplace and in life. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of growth and revelation. I hope Claire's story has inspired you to reflect on the power of empathy in our daily lives and the strength we all have to overcome challenges. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more impactful stories. Until next time, take care and remember that every person's story matters.